Okay, last time we looked at this kind of diagram here. We talked about how to understand World War I, you kind of have to go through it piece by piece, puzzle by puzzle piece, to examine all the different factors that are involved in the outbreak of World War I. And last time we talked about economic growth and how that fueled social tension. Today we're going to talk about social tension and ethnic tension across Europe. And then we're going to get into how, as a result of this strong sense of nationalism that kind of linked everybody together and created a common bond among nations, how this nationalism resulted in these development of these competing alliances. So that by the time we get to the outbreak of World War I, by the time we get to the early 20th century, Europe had basically become an armed camp, where you had two major military alliances armed to the teeth, ready to go at it at a moment's notice, at a drop of a hat. And so today we're going to talk about how how nationalism fueled this development of these competing alliances in the second half of the 19th, early 20th century. Now, we talked about how there were social tensions. We talked about how the aristocracy was still in Europe. The landed aristocracy was still there, still relevant, but very anxious. You know, their traditional leadership had been challenged. They were no longer the top dog, and they were accustomed to being top dog. It's hard to play second fiddle when you're used to being number one, right? We all know, maybe played on a sports team where you were starting and then you're taking off the starting team, you're put on the bench. That can be a little hard on the ego. I don't know if anybody does sports, but you know, maybe you've experienced that. But that's how it was when the stakes were much higher. We're talking about your whole family status is under threat. And so you had your anxious aristocracy. And you also had very confident rising middle class. And we talked about the middle class last time. But a third factor that we see happening in this time was the rise of a very militant working class that came to represent the workers. We talked about how a lot of the economic problems that came out of the late 19th century, a lot of the people who bear the brunt of those economic problems were working class people, the growing ranks of people who worked for wages and lived in cities and worked in factories and mines. And they were a rising number. They were growing exponentially. You know, many people across Europe and the world were leaving rural areas to find work, and they were working in big cities and working in factories and mines. And many of them were very unhappy for the reasons that we discussed. You know, all the fears that they had and all the anxiety that they felt. Now, what we see happening is that in this time period, there was a political movement to reach out to these disaffected workers and to build a political power base. Now, in the mid to late 19th century, all the political working class movements, for obvious reasons, embraced socialism. You know, the ideas of Karl Marx, the idea that they could, because you know that would be if that vision of Karl Marx was to be achieved, it would mean it would only benefit the working classes. I mean, they had nothing to lose. As Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, they had nothing to lose but their chains. So if you have nothing to lose, then basically why not go for the jugular and start a world revolution and make your life better? And that's how. So you know, desperate times. You've heard that phrase. Desperate times lead to desperate measures. And but now not all working class political movements were the same, though. And what we see happening when we look at these political movements is that some working class political movements were fairly peaceful and legal. They wanted to achieve the aims of socialism not by a violent world revolution, but through kind of gradual legislation, whereas others were much more radical. Just to give you a couple examples here. Like one of the most impressive and popular working class movements was the Social Democratic Party. This is a party that still exists in Germany today. And it grew among the, it goes back to 1875. It grew up along the ranks of the working class unions. Union movement had started. People were joining unions. Now one thing about the Social Democratic Party, even though it embraced to a certain degree socialism, Karl Marx hated this party because they were non-confrontational. In other words, they were very political. They wanted to achieve and benefit achieve the goals of the working class through legislation, through the legal process. They wanted to work with the government, work with the political process to achieve their goals. But they were by far the most successful of the working class parties because they worked within the political system. And remember, Germany had a constitution, had elections. They could put up candidates for the Reichstag, the lower, kind of like the House of Representatives of federal Germany. Another very successful party that still exists today is the Labour Party. That's how you spell labor in England. It's not a misspelling. Now, the Labour Party got organized a little later in 1893, and it had a similar background to the Social Democratic Party of Germany. It was organized by union leaders. It was a working class movement organized by union leaders. It embraced the ideas of socialism to a certain degree, but it also believed in democracy and representative government, and wanted to work through the political process to achieve their goals of raising up the standards and status of the working people, the working class. Now, this party still exists. In England, the Labour Party kind of absorbed the old Liberal Party, the old Whig Party, and so today, in current Great Britain, you have the Conservative or Tory Party and the Labour Party. So you have the Labour Party was so successful that they kind of swallowed whole the old Whig Party of Gladstone, and now you have a single party, the Labour Party. The United States actually had its own version of a working class party. It's called the Populist Party, that claimed to represent farmers and workers. It only lasted for a couple of election cycles. In 1896, it fused with the Democratic Party, and so now you have a lot of the goals of the Populist Party are now represented by the Democrats. We also had a Socialist Party in America that was very similar in its outlook to the Social Democratic Party of Germany, that it represented working people, wanted to work within the system, wanted to work through elections, and it actually ran, Eugene Debs was the perennial candidate of the Socialist Party in America at the turn of the 20th century. He never won an election. Now, after 1924, the Socialist Party merged pretty much with the Democratic Party. So today's Democratic Party contains the old, what would be the remnants of the old populist and socialist parties in American history. Yes.
Okay, the Social Democratic Party, that's different than National Socialist.
Yes,
okay.
They're very different. Yeah, the National Socialists would be the Nazis.
Yeah.
The Social Democratic Party were they were the enemies of the Nazis.
Just making sure.
Yeah, and throughout the whole period. All right. So now what we see happening is that in a lot of countries in Europe, the working class party was called, well, based on the country where they spoke different languages, but it was called just the Workers' Party. So you had a Workers' Party in France. In 1882, they actually implemented a constitutional change that lowered the right to vote. I mean, it gave the right to vote to people who had less property. It lowered the property qualifications. That made more people eligible to vote, and workers organized a Workers' Party in Italy in 1882. Same thing happened in Belgium. In 1885, Belgium instituted a constitutional change that lowered the property qualification to vote so that more people were eligible to vote, and this allowed working people to vote, and they organized a Workers' Party by 1885. Now, in all these countries that I've just mentioned, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, and Belgium, all those countries had written constitutions, and they had a political process that allowed workers to participate in the political process and to vote and to run for office. Now, what do you do in a country that has no constitution, a very autocratic country like Russia? Well,
Viva la revolution.
Yeah, in Russia they organized their own. They organized a party. It was illegal. I mean, there were no political parties in Russia because there were no elections. There was no constitution. But they organized the Social Democratic Labor Party. I don't know how you say that in Russian, but that was organized in 1898. But it had a much more, since these people were all doing things that were illegal anyway, it didn't have the option of participating in the political process. So it was, by default, it was a lot more radical than the other parties that could operate freely because the Constitution that was set up allowed them to. Now, among socialists, among working class parties, there was a big debate in the beginning of the late 19th into the early 20th century about tactics. I mean, all socialists would agree that Marx's vision of a classless society was the ultimate goal. But the question was, how do you get there? How do you create a classless society? Now, on one hand, you had many people who believed that this could be achieved incrementally, gradually, over time. It might take 100 years. It might take 150 years. But through the political process, through elections, through the democratic process, over time, laws could be passed, and you could, through the legal process, through a peaceful legal process, through the democratic process, you could achieve socialism. Now, in Great Britain, there was an organization called the Fabian Society, and they were the spokespersons, or they most forcefully spoke out for this vision of gradual incremental change. And you'd find among the Labour Party in Great Britain and the Social Democratic Party, you'd find people who would embrace that idea in those parties because they could see in their own experience that they could use the political process to achieve their goals. Now, on the other hand, you had others who believed that the only way to achieve Marx's vision was through violent revolution. The only way to get rid of the bourgeoisie is just to kill the bastards. You just got to kill them. You got to have a violent revolution. You got to kill people. You got to have blood. You got to have violence. These people were called anarchists. Now, they weren't called anarchists because they didn't believe they believed in anarchy. They were called anarchists because they believed that all governments, as they stood now, were instruments of oppression. That all governments existed to keep the working people in chains. Therefore, any attack on the government was legitimate because all governments were illegitimate. So if all governments are illegitimate, you're acting legitimately to destroy them, right? That makes sense, right? So an anarchist believed that if they begin to embrace this idea of terrorism, the anarchists were the world's first terrorists. They believed that if they could blow up enough buildings and kill enough people, that the governments would get scared. They would become even more repressive and even more violent to quash the uprising, and this would eventually lead to a worldwide revolution that would destroy the bourgeoisie, destroy capitalism, and rising from the ruins would be the new classless society. There was actually a literary and artistic movement that was very popular in this day called Futurism, the Futurists, who believed that only through violence and destruction could a new world order arise. So they advocated mass violence and destruction and blowing up buildings, and that was the way to achieve a whole new world order. So they kind of they worshipped violence. They loved violence. In fact, Mussolini, when he was a young man before he became a fascist, was a big futurist believer. He loved this idea. I'm going to go out and kill people because I'm creating a new world order through violence. Yeah, it was kind of like death metal. I don't know. You ever watch some of these heavy metal bands? They're all like, kill the people, The futurists would have loved that kind of stuff. They would have loved it. They would have eaten it up. All right. So anarchists actually, they made good their promises. There were a number of prominent people who were assassinated, world leaders assassinated by anarchists in this period. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, 1881, somebody threw a bomb into his car, blew up the car, killed the Tsar. The President of France, Sadi Carnot, 1894, killed by an anarchist. A President of the United States, William McKinley, President of the United States, killed by an anarchist in 1901. So even got a United States President, the third President of the United States to be assassinated. Now, now these violent acts scared a lot of people, but there are other people who believe that who still stuck to this idea that you could have incremental change and you could make improvements for the working class without mass violence, without killing a lot of people. And there were some examples where this took place. Incremental, but for sure. Like, for example, in Germany, the Social Democratic Party actually worked with Bismarck. Bismarck needed them. He needed their votes. And, you know, we already talked about Bismarck already. He was a pragmatist. He needed the Social Democratic Party votes, so he worked with the Social Democrats to get what we would call workmen's compensation for the first time for German workers in 1884. It was, the idea was now that companies were responsible for the well-being of the workforce, the well-being of their workers. And so under accident insurance, if somebody was hurt on the job, the company was liable for their medical bills, to pay for their medical bills. So this you don't think that, well, that wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal because it was seen, this is a practical way that government and socialists who believe in democracy can work to achieve a goal. In Great Britain, the Labour Party, it was called workmen's compensation. And in fact, in this country, in the 1890s, in the early part of the 20th century, many states passed laws. In the United States, they borrowed it from the British, so it was called workmen's compensation. In fact, but it wasn't until 1916 that the federal government, the Kern-McGillicuddy Act, you have to know that, 1916, established workmen's compensation for all federal workers. But anyway, so it was kind of, it took a little time, and it was actually the Democratic Party in the United States that pushed for workmen's compensation. Remember, they're the ones who kind of were fused with the populists and then the socialists. All right, so there was a lot of tension in the area. We had anarchists, we had these working man's parties, and a lot of times the one social group that was most frightened by the ideas of socialism would be the middle class, because many of them included businessmen and entrepreneurs, and they had the most to lose from any kind of system that would tax them or seize their property for the benefit of the working classes. All right, now there's also, got to remember at this time, a lot of cultural and ethnic tension all across Europe. In every country of Europe, not everybody was alike. In other words, in every country in Europe, you had a particular group of people that were unhappy for a variety of reasons with their situation. And I'm just going to quickly go over and give you a couple of examples. Like in Great Britain, you had the problem of the Irish. You know, Ireland was still part of Great Britain, and the vast majority of people in Ireland were Roman Catholics, and the Roman Catholic Irish were not too happy with rule by London, by Scots and Irish and Englishmen who were Protestant. Now, it was not just a religious issue; it was a cultural issue also. I mean, you had a lot of people who were Catholic Irish who were very radical, but their Catholicism was kind of like a mark of their culture. It wasn't so much a spiritual identity as much as it was like, I'm Catholic because my parents were Catholic. We have 10 generations of Catholics. That's who we are. You know, that's what our ethnicity is. You know, and actually you had the Fenians were we've already mentioned them. They were radicals who wanted to see Ireland independent and become an independent republic and break free from British rule. So you had that going on in Great Britain. Now, the Irish would be an example of a group of people within a country who were unhappy with where they stood. In France, you had in northern France, along the coast, you had a whole area called Brittany. The people who lived there were called Bretons, and they kind of spoke their own dialect of French. Brittany, this region of France, was kind of rural, kind of backward. The people there were staunch conservatives. They were all Roman, very staunchly supportive of the Roman Catholic Church. They all tended to be people who didn't like Parisians and big city people. So you had that dynamic going on there. So even within France, you'd find areas of France that were disaffected, or felt like other Frenchmen were the enemy, or didn't like didn't like these other people. For example, in France, conservative Roman Catholic French in a lot of the rural areas, the two things they hated most were Protestants and Jews. So there was even a movement in France to try to purge the army of Protestants and Jews because they were seen as not real Frenchmen. So there was some cultural division going on in France because there were sizable minorities also of Jews and Protestants who lived within France. In Spain, Spain was a country where you had the Basques who lived up in the northeastern part of Spain who didn't even speak an Indo-European language. They lived in a very mountainous rural area. They were very conservative, very Roman Catholic. And then on the other side of Spain, you had the Catalans. They spoke a different dialect of Spanish, and they were all. Catalonia was kind of like the industrial heartland of Spain, and they tended to be very secular and embraced secular ideas and very critical of the Roman Catholic Church. But they also didn't like the government of Spain that was seen as this being Castilian Spanish. You got to remember that when you learn Spanish, you're actually learning Castilian Spanish. You're not learning. Spanish has a lot of varieties. It's a very diverse language, but you're not learning Catalonian Spanish. You're learning Castilian Spanish. And a lot of people in Catalonia were thinking, I don't like this. We are a different people. In fact, there's a movement today in Catalonia to become an independent nation. They're trying to get a vote to be more autonomous or win their independence. Now in Germany, the big battle was the old battle. It was a battle that's been going on since the Reformation. Northern Germany was very Protestant. It was Lutheran and Calvinist, and Northern Germany was very urbanized in lots of cities and very industrial. And then in the southern part of Germany, it was a whole different story. Very rural, small towns, very Roman Catholic. Bavaria was very Roman Catholic. So in Germany, you had this division. In fact, they had a name for it in Germany. It was called the Kulturkampf. That's how they say it in Germany. Kulturkampf. I don't really know that. Probably it's being recorded. I'll probably be sued by a German. But anyway, but in fact, this Kulturkampf went on, and like one of the big issues, like for example, was it was the same issue in France. Was like who should be in charge of education? Like in France, some people believe that the public schools ought to be completely secular, while the more Roman Catholics in France wanted to continue to see the Roman Catholic Church be in charge of all education, all of elementary and secondary education. In Germany, it was the same thing. Protestants wanted to see secular schools. They wanted to see schools that were not affiliated with any church. Catholics, on the other hand, they wanted to send their kids to parochial schools. They wanted to send their kids to church schools. And many Protestants wanted to pass laws that would make it illegal for parents to send their kids to Catholic schools. So it was a big division in Germany. And in fact, the Roman Catholics in Germany, in the south of Germany, even went to organize their own party. It was called in German, it was different, but it was called, it's translated, means the Center Party. Today, it still exists. Today, it's the big rival of the Social Democrats. They're called the Christian Democratic Party. So they're a party that still exists today, but their roots were as being the Catholic political party that represented Catholic voters in the south of Germany. So Germany was divided at this time. Now compared to Eastern Europe, Western Europe was a piece of cake because Central and Eastern Europe were even more bitterly divided by cultural and ethnic differences. The basket case of all basket cases was Austria-Hungary. Ever since 1867 in Austria-Hungary, you had Germans, the Austrians, they could vote if they had made enough money. There was a property qualification. And you had Hungarians, they could vote, they could elect to the legislature if they made enough money. I think I read somewhere that said that about rounded off to about 7% of the population met the property qualification to vote. So we're not talking about a large segment of the population that could vote. But for all the other ethnic groups that made up the old Habsburg Empire, the old Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they had no rights. They couldn't vote at all. So you had Czechs, Poles, Slovenes, Ruthenians is another name for Ukrainians, Romanians. You still had some Italians. You had Croats and Slovaks. Those are all ethnic groups that had their own history, their own culture, their own language, and they're like. And during this period of nationalism, all these different ethnic groups, they wanted their own government. They resented the fact that they were controlled by a government that was monopolized by just two ethnicities, the Germans, the Austrians, and the Hungarians. And so there was a lot of tension going on in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, what even made the situation even more intense was this idea called Pan-Slavism. You see, the Poles, Slovenes, Czechs, Ruthenians, Romanians, Croats, and Slovaks, all these groups, except for the Italians, they're all what we call Slavic peoples. The Slavic languages are a whole group of related languages, like Germanic languages, like English and German and Dutch, and Danish are all Germanic languages. Well, all these are what we call Slavic languages. And there was a movement afoot in the late 19th century inspired by nationalism that believed that all Slavs had this kind of common heritage and dignity, and there was a lot of mysticism thrown into this. We're like, our roots, we are one people. In ancient times, we all were one. You know, all people got into that stuff. They're like, kind of like, you know, you hear about neo-Nazis today and like Aryan Nation and Christian identity. You know, all these like these racial groups that they've kind of made their race into a religion. You know, you know, for example, on the other side you got like Elijah Muhammad and the Muslim Brotherhood who believe that white people are evil and black people are God's chosen people. So I mean, it's not just Europeans who do this, but everybody does this. You have groups of people who just embrace this idea that their ethnic identity is somehow makes them just so special. I'm so special. Everybody wants to be special. Oh, I'm so wonderful because I'm Czech. I'm so wonderful because I'm Polish. You know, I'm so wonderful because I'm fill in the blank. So people would just embrace this idea, and so you had this movement that had this kind of spiritual element, like, oh, we are all one. We all need to forge a unity and fight the oppressive forces. You know, and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the oppressive force were the Hungarians and the Germans. So if you're a Hungarian and German, you're thinking, all these other people suck. We got to stick together, or they're going to get us. Now you got to remember, you know who grew up in Austria? Adolf Hitler. You know, he was a product of his time. He grew up as a kid in a situation where the Germans were the chosen ones. They had all the power along with the Hungarians, and all these other ethnic groups were considered inferior and of less stature. But Germans felt in a sense, we got to stick together, or these other races, they're going to get us. And the other races were thinking, we got to kill those damn Germans. You know, so you had this kind of this dynamic going on there that was very tense, and it was fueled by this kind of strong, kind of powerful nationalism that we see. And now Russia was also had a problem, and Russia's big problem were the Poles, because remember, ever since the breakup of the Polish kingdom, a big chunk of Poland belonged to Russia. Now the Poles were kind of broken up. Some Poles belonged to Germany. Some Poles belonged to Austria-Hungary. Some Poles belonged to Russia. But the biggest chunk of Poles belonged to Russia. So Russia had a big Polish problem, because in Russia there were no elections. There was no constitution. Poles were basically not allowed to even do anything. So Poles had to organize secret political organizations to try to seek their independence. So you had like the Polish Socialist Party, would be one example. They were both Polish nationalists and socialists. And then you had the National Democratic Party of Poland. And these groups were working under the radar, trying to organize a revolution. They wanted to overthrow the Russians and achieve Polish independence. So in the case of Russia and Austria-Hungary, these two countries were dealing with a situation where they had ethnic minorities that wanted to be free, and they had to deal with them. They had to try to keep these ethnic minorities from rebelling and creating problems. So, now, what we see happening is that during this time period, you have all these countries and all these nations in Europe, and they have all these social and cultural tensions. And the one thing that could keep all these countries together and keep them from breaking apart was a strong sense of nationalism, the sense that they all had a common vision, a common goal, a common ancestry, a common destiny, and that they needed to work to protect their nation from external threats. So there was a lot of defensiveness going on here, where all these nations kind of felt like their nation needed to assert itself, that their nation was under threat, and they needed to take defensive action to protect their national interests. So that's where the competing alliances come into place, where nations of Europe decided to organize these alliances to protect their national interests, so that nations that had a common enemy would come together to form an alliance so that they could defend themselves. So by the time we get to the eve of World War I, you had two competing alliances. You had the Triple Entente, as it was called, France, Great Britain, and Russia. And then you had the so-called Central Powers, because they were in the central part of Europe, Germany and Austria-Hungary. So let's see if this link works. So if you look at a map of Europe in 1914, you would have the Triple Entente with Great Britain, France, and Russia. And their enemies would be the so-called Central Powers, Austria-Hungary and Germany. As you see how they're like right in the middle, that's where you get the term Central Powers. So that was the political alliance system that arose. All right, the question is, though, how did we get there? How did we get to that situation where you had these two sets of competing alliances? And so that's what we're going to do now, is look at, is to examine how this situation arose. All right, now Bismarck was in charge of Germany at the time. He was the prime minister appointed by the Emperor of Germany, who only answered to the Emperor of Germany, William I. And Bismarck knew one thing. He knew that after all that had been done, that who wanted vengeance against Germany? No. Who had been the last nation to be defeated by Germans when they won their independence? France. That's right. Remember, they took away Austria. They took away Alsace-Lorraine. And remember, they declared the unification of Germany. They recognized William I as the Kaiser, where? In the Palace of Versailles, right outside Paris. Versailles had one time been like the Gloria of France. That was where Louis XIV built. That was when France was a major country. With Louis XIV and all that, and he had built the Hall of Mirrors and built the Palace of Versailles. How humiliating is that? That the Germans, of all people, would unify their country in France. I mean, and just step all over them. So the France wanted vengeance, and they wanted Alsace-Lorraine back. So Bismarck's whole strategy when he was running foreign affairs for Germany is his number one goal was to keep France isolated. He knew that France, if it was going to defeat Germany, needed an ally. So as long as France didn't have any allies, France could be neutralized. France was not a threat to Germany as long as France was by itself and isolated and didn't have any friends. So Bismarck did everything he could to make sure that France was the one guy who didn't get invited to the party. So one of the first things he did was that he realized that Russia, Austria-Hungary, well, I should have said Germany here. That's bad. I should have corrected that. But anyway. One thing that Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary all had in common was that they all ruled over Poles. So they had a lot in common in the sense that they all had to deal with the Polish problem. And so, and they're all very conservative empires. You know, you had the Tsar in Russia, you had the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph, you had the German Kaiser William I, and Bismarck arranged for these three emperors to form an alliance called the League of the Three Emperors. And this was a league that could be renewed every 3 years. So every 3 years, this league would be renewed. So Bismarck figured that from his point of view, he didn't have to worry about Great Britain, because Great Britain only got involved in wars in Europe if its empire in India was threatened, or its empire anywhere was threatened. So Bismarck didn't even think about that Britain would be even be a concern of his. He figured Great Britain and France would never make an alliance with one another because, you know, Germany, he just knew not to mess around with the British Empire overseas. So Bismarck figured that Russia and Austria-Hungary could potentially form an alliance with France, so it was important to keep them on his side. So the League of the Three Emperors allowed for Bismarck to keep Austria-Hungary and Russia on his side. The problem that would arise would be that Austria-Hungary and Russia had a lot to disagree with. And but Bismarck had enough vision to see that he had to keep those guys on friendly terms and keep them together. For example, one thing that happened was that in 1876, there were some national rebellions against the Ottoman Empire. Bosnia was an area inhabited by Croats and Serbs and Muslim Bosnians. But they're all Slavic peoples. They all speak the same language, except one's are Croats and some are Serbs and some are Muslims. But they all speak Serbo-Croatian. But anyway, in Bosnia had a big revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And Bulgaria was another. Bulgarians are another Slavic people, and they had a big revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In Bulgaria, you had like a very small percentage of the population who were Muslim, who owned all the land, and most of the Bulgarians were serfs and peasants and tenants of these Muslim landowners. So there was a social revolution going on in Bulgaria against the Ottoman Empire. But you see, these revolts happened at a time when the Ottoman Empire had taken some steps in the mid part of the 19th century to become stronger. Remember, they had been the dying man of the European world for a long time. But in the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman sultans began a program that was called Tanzimat, and the idea was to try to reform their military and their bureaucracy along Western lines. So what they did was they imitated France and Great Britain, and they brought in new ways of training their bureaucrats. They got rid of the Janissaries. They did that in 1826, but they created a whole new army that was trained in Western methods of fighting, using, being trained by often British and French military advisors. So the Ottoman Empire had taken steps to be more effective, and they used this new, more effective military to great use. In Bosnia and in Bulgaria, they went on a rampage. I mean, thousands of people were killed. Now, at this time, these events got the Serbs all riled up. Now, Serbia had won autonomy from the Ottoman Empire in 1815. So the Serbs had their own king, but they were still had to pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. But in 1876, given the outbreaks of war in Bulgaria and Bosnia, the Serbs decided now was the time to seek their independence. And they were led by King Milan Obrenović, and they decided to go to war to try to win their independence from the Ottoman Empire. Now, a lot of Serbs, they saw that there were Serbs in Bosnia, and they wanted to create a greater Serbia, so they were inspired by nationalism, by the revolt in Bosnia to get the ball rolling and start this revolution and overthrow Ottoman rule. So now this Serbian-Turkish war did not go well for the Serbs. You know, the Turks they had reformed their military. They were stronger, more lean military, and they crushed the Serbs. They crushed just like they crushed the Bulgarians and the Bosnians. Okay, this is what you got to remember, though. Serbs and Bulgarians are Orthodox Christians, and they're Slavs. Now in Russian nationalists had kind of embraced the idea that Russia was the home of all the Slavs. There was this mythology that Russia was the earliest and first of all the Slavic people. So a lot of pan-Slavics were in love with Russia. And at the same time, the Russian Tsar was the head of the Orthodox Church. He was the Pope of the Orthodox Church. He was the Pope and the Emperor, Pseudo-Papism. So Russia decided that they had to take action. They couldn't sit quietly and see fellow Slavs and fellow Orthodox Christians be slaughtered and murdered by a bunch of heathen Muslims. And it was part of, you got to know there was a lot of strong nationalism going on in Russia at this time. So, in 1877, Russia declared war on Turkey. It's called the Russo-Turkish War. Now, remember they fought a war against Turkey in the Crimean War some 20 years earlier, and that hadn't gone so well. But now you had a new Russian military. You remember they had freed the serfs, and now all serfs are required to do up to 25 years of military service. So Russia had this huge standing army and a reformed standing army. And so the new reformed huge standing army of Russia went against the reformed Ottoman army, and the Russians kicked butt. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, basically Russian armies almost marched all the way to Constantinople. I mean, they almost took Constantinople. The Turks were completely beaten up. It was a complete victory for Russia. And after just completely humiliating the Turks, Russia was in a position to dictate the terms that ended the war. And what they forced Turkey to sign was the Treaty of San Stefano. Basically, under this treaty, Russia had to give up all claims to the Balkans. So now, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, all those countries that had even been nominally under Ottoman control, they're all free and independent nations, thanks to Mother Russia.
You mean the Turks had to give up all?
Oh, the Turks had to give up all.
Okay.
What did I say?
You said the Russians.
Oh, sorry. I mixed up here. Rewind. All right, now.
I like to say that's a heck of a way to spin a figure.
Yeah.
That's a bad
I do that a lot. I
training.
think it's the Alzheimer's or kicking in at an early stage, But anyway.
Wait, they gave up what?
The Ottoman Empire had to give up all their land in the Balkans, right? And one of the things that happened with all this was that Bulgaria, for the first time, won its independence. One of the first things the Bulgarians did was to expel over 1 million ethnic Turks out of Bulgaria. I mean, it took them a while. It wasn't until the 1930s that they did it. But a new independent Bulgaria was created. Now, in all these countries where the Russians had liberated, you had pro-Russian governments now in power. In Bulgaria, in Serbia, all those countries. Now, this turn of events really created a lot of problems. It created a lot of problems because, you see, the Austro-Hungarians were thinking, he just freed all these Slavic peoples. We rule over Slavic peoples. What happens if the spirit of Slavic independence that the Russians have got the ball rolling happens to our country? Do we want our empire to break up? Today, the Ottoman Empire, tomorrow, the Austro-Hungarian Empire? So Austro-Hungarian Empire was thinking, this is scary. We don't want to get these Slavs all riled up, because if they do, they might want to try to win their independence in our empire. So the Austro-Hungarians were freaking out by what the Russians had done. Now, another country that was freaking out was Great Britain, Can you even tell me why Great Britain would be freaking out?
Because Ottoman Empire's access to India.
Because the Ottoman Empire in the Near East, which was included the Ottoman Empire, was their lifeline to India. And they didn't want to see a powerful Russia dominating the Near East. They preferred a weak Ottoman Empire instead. So the Brits were kind of freaking out. So this was creating a situation where it was there was a crisis in Europe. Austro-Hungarians were pointing fingers at the Russians. And now Bismarck's greatest fear would be that he would have to choose between the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians. And that would mean that whoever he didn't choose would make an alliance with who? France. So he wanted to patch up things up between Austria-Hungary and Russia. He didn't want to get Great Britain involved, because if Great Britain got involved, then they might ally themselves with France or create some problems. So Bismarck's goal was to try to diffuse the situation and patch up the situation between Russia and Austria-Hungary, so there would be some kind of there wouldn't be a breakup. So he wouldn't have to make a choice between allying with Russia or allying with Austria-Hungary. So to diffuse this crisis, Bismarck called for the Congress of Berlin. The Congress of Berlin is kind of like the Congress of Vienna, except that the guy running the show was Bismarck and not Metternich. But it was the same idea, that if you get a bunch of diplomats together, they can resolve differences, and the world powers can get together and try to sort out the differences and award land to this and that, and hopefully everything works out and everybody's happy. And that's what they did. The Congress of Berlin was probably Bismarck at his greatest international influence. Now, what did they decide to do? Well, one of the things they decided to do was to make Bulgaria a lot smaller. So they took a big chunk of Bulgaria called Eastern Rumelia, and they gave it back to the Ottoman Empire. So they gave Ottoman Empire was given back some land, and then they decided that Bulgaria needed a more independent government that wasn't just a puppet of the Russians. So it was decided that the new independent country of Bulgaria would have a constitutional monarchy, and they picked a good German to be its first king. Go figure. You know, they're all Bulgarians, let's pick a German. Well, that made Austria-Hungary happy. You know, that there'd be a good German who would be the first king of an independent Bulgaria. His name was Alexander of Battenberg. There's a picture of him right there. He grew a big old beard, so he looked more Bulgarian, you know. He also converted to the Orthodox faith so that he may be more acceptable to the bulk of the Bulgarians. Now, another thing they decided to do was that to make Great Britain, kind of rest assured Great Britain that everything was going to be okay, they decided to give the island of Cyprus. The island of Cyprus was taken to the Ottoman Empire and given to the Brits. The reason for that was with the control of the island of Cyprus, the British had a naval installation right in the eastern Mediterranean. Remember, the major concern of the British was to maintain their lifeline to India. So by giving them Cyprus, an island in the eastern Mediterranean, this gave Great Britain a naval base and a military installation to secure their routes through the Near East. All right, so that being done, so that also came about. Now, to make Austria-Hungary happy, see, Austria-Hungary was afraid of a big, giant Slavic uprising. So what they decided to do was Bosnia-Herzegovina, the area of Bosnia, it was to remain part of the Ottoman Empire, but it was to be occupied by Austrian-Hungarian troops. So it became a protectorate of Austria-Hungary. So it still technically belonged to the Ottoman Empire, but it was administered and occupied by Austro-Hungarian forces. Now the reason why they wanted that is because that way the Austro-Hungarians could have a military presence and keep a lid on those pesky Serbs. See, they didn't want the Serbs to ally themselves with Serbs in Bosnia and try to get all excited about a new greater Serbian nation. They didn't want to see that happen. They wanted to keep the Serbs in check. So Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina with its large Serbian population to keep the Serbs in check. And that was enough to satisfy the Austro-Hungarians. They felt like they got a good deal out of it. So the Congress of of Berlin was a great success for Bismarck because it ended the strife, ended the crisis, and it I mean, both Russia and Austria-Hungary were not happy, but at least they weren't going to war with each other. So, and that was a great success. All right, but the whole thing caused Bismarck to believe that he had to make some adjustments in his thinking. And we'll talk about that next, and how these alliance systems came into play. So why don't we, gone for quite a long time, why don't we take a break for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll finish up.
How was the Austria-Hungary and Bismarck became?
Now, okay, now the Bismarck, to measure the success of the Congress of Berlin, one of the things that he did was he salvaged the League of the Three Emperors. Remember, that had to be approved every 3 years, and so he managed to get Russia and Austria-Hungary patch up their differences enough that the League of the Three Emperors remained intact. So that meant that he continued to keep France isolated. Now, but he also realized in 1879 that he had to do something to make sure that Austria-Hungary and Germany were always together, and it had to do with nationalism. I mean, we talked about the Prusso-Austrian War in 1866. Well, this was a situation where it was Germans against the world, in other words. So Austria-Hungary included Austrian Germans. Remember, Germany itself included a large numbers of Roman Catholic Germans who were very similar in culture to the Austrian Roman Catholic Germans. So it was important to keep the Germans united. So in 1879, Bismarck negotiated to create an alliance, a military alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary. And this alliance would stay true all the way till 1918. It was a very powerful, they were allied by language and culture, and these two empires were locked from 1879 on. Now, in 1882, he found somebody else to pick on, but somebody else to make an alliance with against the French. You know, his goal was to keep every country in Europe allied with Germany and keep France alone and isolated. And he found a way to do it. In 1882, a military alliance was organized between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. Now, why would Italy join an alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany? Well, because they didn't like, who was the odd man out? France. See, what had happened is that, and here you again you see nationalism raising its head. What had happened is that in 1881, the year before this, the French had intervened in the land of Tunis. Tunis is in North Africa. It's right next to Algiers. Remember, the French controlled Algiers since 1830, and they colonized it. Now, right next to Algeria is Tunisia, or Tunis. Now, Tunisia was ruled by a Muslim ruler called the Bey. That was his title. And he was technically a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, but distant name only. But what had happened is that the Bey of Tunis had borrowed huge sums of money from French bankers and had used that money to build railroads and infrastructure, but also to finance a very large harem. He liked luxury living. Well, anyway, it looked like the Bey of Tunis was not going to pay his debts. He had gotten such a situation where you had a lot of French bankers who were going to lose a lot of money. So the French government decided that they needed to intervene to protect their investments. So in 1881, French forces occupied Tunis for the purposes of taking over the country to make sure that the country honors its debts to French bankers. Now, why would this make the Italians mad? Well, you see, I should have had a map here. Maybe I can bring up that old map. But you see, Tunis is very close to Sicily. It's right across the Mediterranean from Sicily and Italy. And you see, at this time, there are a lot of Italians who had this vision that they could revive the Roman Empire. They saw a powerful Italy with a navy dominating the entire Mediterranean Sea. So there are all these Italian nationalists who have this vision of glory for Italy becoming this great military power and dominating the Mediterranean. And to have the French right on their doorstep, taking over a country, that really angered a lot of Italian nationalists. And so the Italians, seeing that they didn't like the French, Bismarck said, hey, look, Italy, you don't like the French, we don't like the French, let's form an alliance. Now, this created a problem for the Italians because a lot of Italians viewed the Austro-Hungarian Empire as their mortal enemy because there were still ethnic Italians in the Alps that were ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Italy was kind of two minds on this. There were some Italians who said, hey, no, we need to make an alliance with anybody who's against the Austro-Hungarians because they're our enemy. And there were other Italians who said, no, the French are our enemy because look what they did in Tunis. So the side that saw the French as the enemy, they won out, and that's why the Triple Alliance was formed.
I said Tunis was in Algeria?
It's right next to Algeria.
Okay.
I want to see how to get that map. That's right. Oh, it didn't show that. Too bad. But see, here's Tunis is like right here.
Oh, I was
Here's
thinking
Algeria.
of Albania. That's why I was confused.
Oh, you were getting Tunis and Albania. Albania is over here.
Yeah, that's what I
Okay.
was thinking.
All right. All right. Now, so by 1882, Bismarck thinks he's got his mate. He's got France completely isolated. He's got Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Germany in the Triple Alliance. He's got Austria-Hungary and Germany in the Dual Alliance. He's got the League of Three Emperors, where he's got Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And in his calculations, Great Britain doesn't care as long as their empire is not threatened. So basically, France is alone and isolated. He's thinking, yeah, this is awesome. France can't do anything unless they get a friend. They have no friends. So Bismarck's on top of his game. But unfortunately, things in the Balkans started to heat up again. Now, it turns out that, you remember Bulgaria and you had Serbia? Right. It gets a little complicated here. Okay, Bulgaria didn't like being told what to do by the Russians. So Alexander of Battenberg, the new constitutional monarch, he decided to dismiss his pro-Russian ministers and go it alone. At the same time, Serbia was, Milano Brenović, the king of Serbia, was thinking, I don't like taking orders from the Russians. We're Serbs. Why should the Russians tell us what to do? So they were independent. They became more independent-minded. And then at the same time, Serbia and Bulgaria decided that they had conflicting goals. You see, Serbia wanted to create Greater Serbia under the 13th century king Stephen Dušan. So they had visions of recreating the Serbian Empire of the 13th century. Greater Serbia. Now the Bulgarians, though, they wanted to recreate the Greater Bulgaria of Boris of Bulgaria of the 9th century. So the Bulgarians were thinking, we will create Greater Bulgaria. And the Serbians were thinking, we will create Greater Serbia. Now they speak the same frickin' language. Bulgarian and Serbian are freaking identical languages. But no, we're Bulgarian. No, we are Serbs. No, we are Bulgaria. And see, there's this country called Macedonia. There was this country called Macedonia that was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And the Bulgarians said, Macedonia is Bulgaria. And the Serbs said, no, Macedonia is Serbia. And then the Greeks said, no, Macedonia is Greece. And then the Macedonians said, no, Macedonia is Macedonia. That was all going on at this time. Everybody's just going, we all had these national aspirations. So what happened is Serbia and Bulgaria went to war with each other over who was going to be the dominant Balkan power. Now, Austria-Hungary is thinking, hey, we don't want a war to break out because we don't want these Slavs to get all heated, hot and bothered about nationalism because that's a threat to our empire. So the Austro-Hungarian, what they did is that Austro-Hungarian Empire, they intervened. They brought both sides together. It turns out that Alexander of Battenberg, the king of Bulgaria, Milano Brenović, the king of Serbia, they had personal ties with Austria-Hungary, and they agreed to a conference, and it was Austria-Hungary used its influence to bring an end to this war. You think, oh, that's a good thing. Austria-Hungary, nobody wants war. Austria-Hungary is trying to prevent a war. That's a great thing, right? Good thing, right? But then the Russians were thinking, this is terrific. The Russians were thinking, we fought a war to free these people in 1877. Russian blood was spilled for the independence of Bulgaria and Serbia, and now they're toting to our rivals, the Austro-Hungarians. This is a threat to Russia. We want Russia, 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 Russia. They were getting all excited. We got to teach this guy a lesson. So Russian special agents, in 1886, they went right to Bulgaria. They nabbed Alexander of Battenberg. They brought him back to Russia. They beat the crap out of him. They tortured him. They starved him, and he abdicated the throne. And the Russians said, yeah, that's how you take care of business. Well, anyway, the whole world was shocked. The whole world was like, how do you do that? You kidnap a head of state, you take him to your country, you torture him, and force him to abdicate? That is unacceptable. The whole world was like, this is shocking. Austria-Hungary, shocking. Bismarck, shocking. Great Britain, shocking. There was one country that said, well, I can see why the Russians did it. But the Russians knew what. There was one country in all of Europe that was different and said, oh, the Russians can do it. I understand where the Russians are coming from. Guess what country that was? France. Because they're looking for an ally. They don't have any friends. They got to find somebody to like them. So now there was this whole, in France, there was a whole political movement called the French League of Patriots, whose sole goal was to go to war against Germany. So you had a whole lobby of Frenchmen in the French Republic who said, war against Germany at any cost. We got to go kick those Germans. We got to defeat the Germans, get revenge. So the French were like, the French were all appealing to all of Europe to be friends with the Russians. Now, when this happened, Bismarck, he decided, in 1886 when this was all going on, Bismarck decided that now it was time to get everybody in Germany excited. You see, the way it worked with Germany at this time was that the one thing that the German parliament could do, the Reichstag could do, was that they had to give military credits. Every 10 years, the German military got its budget. That's how it worked. The German budget wasn't voted on every year. Every 10 years, you'd have an election, and then the parliament would vote money for the military. Now, Bismarck needed money for the military, because those were his Junker buddies. Remember, the German military was dominated by Junkers, his aristocratic friends. He wanted to make sure that they all had good jobs and were set for life. So he knew one way to get a lot of money for the military was to say, there's a war going to break out. So what Bismarck started saying is, look, the French are supporting the Russians are acting out of control. Obviously, Germany needs to go to war against France. So Bismarck's like pounding the pavement saying, war against France is imminent. We need to go to war against France because the French are supporting the Russians, and the Russians are acting terrible and are acting against international law and doing everything that's evil and wrong. And so then, all of a sudden, the parliament has a vote, and they said, we got to support our military, and they give everything Bismarck wants. So Bismarck gets a big, huge budget for the German military. All of his Junker friends are, and then Bismarck turns around and says, well, maybe we don't need to go to war against France. Maybe we need to sit down and relax. So that's what he did. He sat down and he approached Russia in 1887. He said, look, I know you probably don't want to sign up for the League of the Three Emperors anymore because you don't like Austria-Hungary. I understand that. But there's no reason why you and I can't be friends, why Germany and Russia can't be friends, And so all that was done, and all this pounding on the pavement and call for war, Bismarck engineered an agreement with Russia. The League of the Three Emperors was not renewed. Austria-Hungary and Germany were... Austria-Hungary and Russia, were not going to be friends. So Russia and Germany, they signed the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887. All right. So it looks like he's got his money for his military. He's worked out a deal with Russia, so he can have his cake and eat it too. France still doesn't have a friend. But then what happens is that his good friend and buddy, William I, who had always supported him, who had always been there to back him up, William I died. And eventually he would be succeeded by his grandson, William II, in 1888. Now, William II was a proto-Nazi. He believed that the Nazis, the Germans, he wasn't a Nazi, the Nazis didn't exist yet, but he believed in the superiority of the German race. And he even said, why are we breaking all this, wasting all this time to try to be friends with Russia? The Russians are Slavs. They're an inferior people. We should just conquer Russia and kill all the Slavs. We don't need Slavs. We need to stick together with fellow Germans because we are the master race, And so William II could not understand why Bismarck thought it was so important to be friends with Russia. He said, "Why? Russians are inferior peoples. Screw them. We don't need them." So what Francis II did was, when my Alzheimer's. William II did was that when he had differences with Bismarck, he finally dismissed. Bismarck was already in his 80s anyway. But in 1890, Bismarck was let go. He was told by William II, "Your services are no longer needed here. You can go home now, retire." Bismarck didn't like to retire. It was very ignominious. It was very humiliating for him to go through this. But he was fired, basically. But the guy was already in his 80s, so it wasn't like it was time for him to go anyway. But anyway, now in 1890, that reinsurance treaty was up for being renewed, and William II said, "I don't think so. We don't need to be friends with Russia. I don't care about Russia." So William II, the new Kaiser, the new Emperor of Germany, who didn't care for Russia, he didn't renew that treaty. So what do you think happened the very next year? You can see it on the notes here. What do you think happened in 1891? Now that Russia didn't have any kind of agreement with Germany, who did the Russians make an alliance with? France. So France and Russia became allies in 1891. And a lot of it was, this alliance was sealed with a lot of financial agreements. French bankers and investors began to pour money into the Russian economy. So it was, what had happened is that after one of the reasons why the reinsurance treaty had been signed was because part of the agreement included German investors investing in Russia. Now that was kaput. That was no longer on the table. Now it was the French and the Russians having this agreement. The French pouring money into the Russian economy. So you had a Franco-Russian alliance. Now, by the very next year, in 1892, the Germans had already set up the von Schlieffen Plan to wage a two-front war. And the von Schlieffen Plan was put into effect with the idea that now that France and Russia were at war with each other, you had to have a plan on the table to defeat both countries in a very quick war. And under the von Schlieffen Plan, the idea was that they were going to march across Belgium, had to go through Belgium, because that was the fastest rate to get to France, and defeat France within 12 weeks. Why 12 weeks? Because it took 12 weeks for the huge Russian army to fully mobilize. So the idea was to defeat France, go over Belgium, defeat France in 12 weeks, and then after crushing France, moving all of their divisions and all their military forces to attack Russia before Russia could fully mobilize its huge army. And that way they could figure they could win a two-front war, but that was the plan anyway. We were supposed to be out of Iraq in 2003, according to the original plan. See, military plans, they have that way, they give you the sense of, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, it's all going to work out, but they don't take into account all the other factors that nobody can foresee. But anyway, so by 1892, Germany already had a plan in place to wage a two-front war against France and against Russia. Now the last part of that was called the Triple Entente. So how did Great Britain get involved in all this? Why did Great Britain eventually decide to ally themselves with France and Russia? And you should know the answer. Why did Great Britain ever get involved in any war?
Money.
For money, but Germany built up their navy.
Well, you read ahead.
I read the chapter.
But yeah, when William II, here he is up here, when William II began to challenge British naval domination, that's when, and the British Empire, that's when the Brits got involved. And eventually they would join this alliance as well. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about how the imperial competition and imperialism got Great Britain involved in this whole mess. And we'll talk about the events leading up to war on next week.